My wife and her lover thought a heavy dose of crushed sedatives would turn my death into a tragic accident and a $3 million insurance payout. They planned to leave the gas fireplace on and walk away. But the hidden camera I installed right above our hallway was already recording every single word. When her lover whispered that they were finished if I woke up, their perfect murder plot began to collapse. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I could feel the heavy cotton sheets pressing down on my chest. I could see the ambient streetlight filtering through the bedroom blinds, but I could not move a single muscle. My mind was awake, racing with a terrifying clarity, but my body was completely dead. I tried to blink, but my eyelids felt like they were glued shut, leaving only a narrow slit of vision. I tried to twitch my fingers to take a deep breath to scream. Nothing happened. The air in my lungs barely shifted. A cold, chemical numbness had hijacked my entire nervous system. Then the memory hit me, the bourbon. I am Thomas, a 54-year-old senior compliance auditor. For 30 years, my job has been to find the missing numbers, the hidden risks, and the lies people try to bury in complex corporate spreadsheets. I notice everything. But I did not notice my wife of 20 years handing me a glass of my favorite bourbon tonight with a powdery residue clinging to the ice. Patricia had smiled at me. She had kissed my cheek, told me I looked exhausted from tax season, and urged me to drink up and get some rest. Now I was a prisoner inside my own bones. Footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor outside the bedroom. 2 sets of footsteps. One was light, the familiar rhythmic tap of Patricia wearing her house slippers. The other was heavy, confident, wearing leather dress shoes. A man. He walked right into my master bedroom. "Is he out?" the man asked. His voice sent a shockwave of pure adrenaline through my paralyzed heart. I knew that voice. It was Greg. Greg was my brother-in-law. He was a white American success story on the outside, married to Patricia's sister, Susan. Greg was the flashy suburban real estate developer who drove a leased Porsche, wore custom suits to our Sunday church services, and always had a condescending joke about my boring corporate job. "He drank the whole glass," Patricia whispered. Her voice was completely devoid of the warmth she displayed at church bake sales or family barbecues. It was clinical, cold. The pills were crushed perfectly. He will not wake up until tomorrow morning, if he wakes up at all. Greg stepped closer to the bed. I could see his shadow looming over me. I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the faint scent of Patricia's perfume. My wife and my brother-in-law. The betrayal sliced through me, but the terror quickly eclipsed it. They were not just having an affair. They were here for something much worse. "We need to move fast," Greg said, pacing near the foot of the bed. "The bank is threatening to foreclose on the Oakwood development by Friday. If I do not show proof of incoming funds, they will seize everything. Susan will find out. The entire family will find out." "Stop panicking," Patricia replied, her tone sharp and commanding. "Everything is set. Thomas has a $3 million life insurance policy. It clears automatically upon accidental death. We just need to make sure this looks like an accident." Greg walked over to the gas fireplace built into the corner of our master bedroom. It was a luxury feature Patricia had insisted on during our renovation last year. "You are sure the pilot light is off?" Greg asked. "I disabled the igniter this morning," she said. "When you turn the valve, it will just pump raw gas into the room. With the windows locked and the central air turned off, the concentration will be lethal in a few hours. The coroner will rule it carbon monoxide poisoning, a tragic accident caused by a faulty fireplace valve while he was in a deep sleep." My mind screamed. I was going to suffocate in my own bed, fully aware, while my wife and her lover walked away with $3 million. I tried desperately to force my hand to move, to roll my head, to make any sound. My vocal cords were completely paralyzed. The chemical cage held me tight. Greg and Patricia stepped out of the bedroom and into the hallway to discuss the final timeline. They stood directly beneath the ceiling air vent. That was when a single, brilliant spark of hope ignited in my panicked brain. They did not know about the smoke detector. 3 days ago, our affluent neighborhood had experienced a string of aggressive break-ins. Patricia had been out of town visiting her mother. Being a cautious auditor who trusts data over luck, I had hired a private security firm to upgrade our alarm system. They had installed a state-of-the-art motion-activated security camera disguised exactly like a standard smoke detector. It was mounted flush against the ceiling in the hallway, pointing directly at the master bedroom door. It synced immediately to a secure cloud server linked to my personal phone. Right now, that camera was recording in high-definition video and crisp audio. It was capturing Greg pacing. It was capturing Patricia standing with her arms crossed. It was recording the confession of their affair, the financial ruin of Greg's real estate business, and the exact mechanics of my premeditated murder. But the footage would be useless if I was dead. If the gas filled the room, the camera would just record a tragedy. I had to disrupt their timeline. I had to create chaos. I needed to break the silence. "Turn the gas on now," Patricia whispered from the hallway. "I will go downstairs and open the back door so you can leave through the alley." "If he wakes up, we are finished," Greg muttered, his voice trembling slightly. "He is an auditor, Patricia. If he survives this, he will rip my finances apart. He will know." "He is not waking up, Greg. Turn the valve." I heard Greg's leather shoes step back into the bedroom. He walked toward the fireplace. I had seconds. I focused every single ounce of my remaining consciousness on my core, on my center of gravity. I did not try to lift my arms or my legs. They were too heavy, too saturated with the sedative. Instead, I focused on shifting my dead weight. I lay near the right edge of the mattress. I needed to roll. I gathered my breath, taking in the tiny amount of oxygen my paralyzed diaphragm would allow. I visualized the muscles in my back and hips. I imagined throwing myself into a void. I commanded my body to move with a primal, desperate rage. It was the anger of being betrayed by the woman I promised my life to. It was the anger of being murdered to fund a failed suburban real estate project. Slowly, agonizingly, my center of gravity began to tilt. It was like moving a boulder underwater. My shoulder inched toward the edge. My hips followed. Greg was kneeling by the fireplace. I could hear the faint, terrifying hiss of natural gas beginning to leak into the room. With one final violent surge of mental command, my body tipped over the precipice of the mattress. I fell hard. My shoulder and my skull slammed against the solid oak hardwood floor. The impact was deafening in the quiet house. A loud, violent crash shook the room. Pain exploded in my shoulder, cutting through the chemical fog, but I welcomed it. Pain meant I was alive. Greg gasped, letting out a pathetic, high-pitched sound of pure terror. The hissing of the gas stopped instantly as he dropped the valve handle. "He fell!" Greg panicked, his footsteps scrambling backward. "Patricia! He is moving!" Patricia rushed back into the room. I lay on the floor, my eyes open to slits, staring at her bare feet. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice losing all its clinical control. "He just rolled off the bed," Greg stammered, his breathing heavy and ragged. "You said he was completely under. You said he would not move." "Shut up!" Patricia hissed. "Help me put him back on the bed." Greg was already backing away toward the door. "No, no way. If he is waking up, he will see me. He will know I am here. I am leaving." "Greg, get back here," Patricia commanded, but it was too late. The heavy thud of his leather shoes sprinted down the hallway right under the hidden camera and down the stairs. I heard the back door slam shut. The grand suburban developer had fled like a coward at the first sign of a disruption. Patricia stood alone in the bedroom, staring down at my paralyzed body. I kept my breathing shallow, staring blankly at the baseboard. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. The gas was not on long enough to kill me. Her partner had run away. If I lay here on the floor until morning, the story would fall apart. If I had a stroke or a brain injury from the fall and the drugs, the hospital would run a toxicology report. She was trapped. She had no choice. She had to play the devoted wife to save herself. I listened as she scrambled to her nightstand, grabbed her phone, and dialed. Her voice instantly transformed. The cold, calculating murderer vanished. In her place was a frantic, weeping, terrified spouse. 911, please help me, she cried into the phone, her voice shaking with perfectly manufactured panic. My husband. I just found my husband on the floor. He is not responding. Please send an ambulance. I think he is having a stroke. As the siren of the ambulance wailed in the distance, growing louder as it approached our affluent suburban street, I lay on the cold, hardwood floor. I was entirely at her mercy physically. I was trapped in a broken, drugged body. But behind my frozen eyes, my mind was sharp-focused and utterly ruthless. They thought they had neutralized a boring accountant. They did not realize they had just awakened an auditor who was about to examine every single aspect of their miserable lives. The camera had captured it all. The war had just begun. The glaring fluorescent lights burned through my eyelids long before I found the strength to open them. A steady, rhythmic beeping echoed in the background, keeping time with a heart that felt incredibly heavy in my chest. I tried to swallow, but my throat was entirely coated in a dry, abrasive layer that tasted like metallic chemicals and stale air. A plastic tube pressed uncomfortably against the back of my right hand. The overwhelming smell of industrial bleach and rubbing alcohol flooded my senses, forcing me into a harsh, waking reality. I finally managed to pry my eyes open. The room surrounding me was a blinding, sterile white. I was lying in a hospital intensive care unit. My body felt like it had been encased in wet, heavy concrete. When I tried to shift my legs, nothing happened. A terrifying numbness radiated from my fingertips all the way down to my toes. I was no longer paralyzed by the immediate acute effects of the sedative, but the lingering damage was profound. My brain was firing commands that my limbs simply refused to obey. A man in a crisp white medical coat stood near the foot of the bed, reviewing a digital tablet. He noticed my eyes open and immediately stepped closer. He introduced himself as Dr. Harrison, a senior attending neurologist at the hospital. His voice was calm and professional as he began to explain the catastrophic events of the previous night. According to the medical charts and the emergency room reports, I had suffered a severe unexplained neurological episode. He described it as a sudden dramatic drop in blood pressure that triggered a minor localized stroke. But then he mentioned the toxicology report. Dr. Harrison adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a mixture of clinical concern and subtle judgment. He explained that they found dangerously high levels of prescription pain medication in my bloodstream. It was the exact same heavy sedative I had been prescribed a year ago for a torn rotator cuff. The doctor gently suggested that perhaps I had accidentally taken a massive double dose in my sleep-deprived state. He explained that combining that specific medication with the alcohol in my evening bourbon had caused my central nervous system to crash. He was giving me the official medical narrative. It was a perfectly logical, perfectly reasonable explanation for an accidental overdose. I stared at the doctor, unable to form the words to correct him. My jaw felt wired shut, and when I tried to speak, only a harsh, garbled sound escaped my lips. I wanted to scream that it was not an accident. I wanted to tell him that my wife had deliberately crushed those pills into a fine powder and dissolved them into the ice of my drink. I wanted to explain that the stroke was exactly what she and her lover had planned. But I was trapped behind a wall of damaged vocal cords and shattered motor functions. I was a prisoner watching a false audit report being filed as the absolute truth. That was when I felt a warm, soft hand wrap tightly around my numb fingers. I forced my heavy gaze to the right side of the bed. Patricia was sitting in a padded visitor chair. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and her eyes were completely red and swollen from crying. She was wearing a simple, modest sweater and holding a damp tissue in her free hand. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against my arm, letting out a long, shuddering sob. Standing right behind her was Pastor Miller from our local suburban church. He was clutching a worn leather Bible and looking down at me with deep pastoral sympathy. 3 other members from our church congregation were hovering near the doorway, holding small bouquets of flowers and glossy get-well-soon cards. Patricia lifted her head and looked directly into the eyes of the neurologist. She delivered an absolute masterclass in deception. Her voice trembled perfectly as she recounted the terrifying moment she found me lying unresponsive on the master bedroom floor. She described how she desperately performed chest compressions, how she prayed to God for my survival, and how she thought her entire world was ending right there on the hardwood planks. She sobbed again, burying her face in the hospital blankets. Pastor Miller placed a comforting hand on her trembling shoulder. He spoke in a soft, reassuring tone, telling her that her faith had guided the ambulance, that her quick thinking had saved my life. He praised her devotion as a wife. The other church members murmured in agreement, wiping their own tearful eyes. They all looked at Patricia with profound admiration and pity. She was the tragic, heroic spouse standing vigil over her gravely ill husband. I watched the entire performance from the prison of my hospital bed. 30 years as a compliance auditor had trained me to spot manufactured emotion, to identify the tiny inconsistencies in a fabricated story. Patricia was flawless. There was no hesitation in her voice, no breaking of character. She played the devout, weeping wife with an intensity that completely manipulated every single person in the room. The doctors believed her. The pastor believed her. Our friends believed her. My mind burned with a silent, furious rage, but I forced my facial expression to remain perfectly blank. I could not give her any indication that I knew the truth. Eventually, the visiting hours reached their limit. Dr. Harrison quietly excused himself to check on other patients, advising Patricia to keep my stimulation to a minimum. Pastor Miller offered one final lengthy prayer over my bed before ushering the rest of the church members out into the hallway. The heavy wooden door of the intensive care room swung shut and the latch clicked firmly into place. We were finally alone. The transformation was immediate and chilling. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. Patricia released my hand as if my skin had suddenly caught fire. She sat back in her chair and her posture completely shifted. The slumped shoulders of a grieving wife were replaced by the rigid, straight spine of a predator. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a compact mirror, and casually checked her makeup. She wiped away the last fake tear with absolute precision, leaving no trace of the weeping woman who had just deceived the entire medical staff. She closed the compact mirror with a sharp snap and turned her eyes back to me. The warmth was gone. Her gaze was filled with an icy, calculating contempt. She leaned closer to the bed, her face hovering just inches above mine. She lowered her voice to a soft, dangerous whisper, ensuring the sound would not carry past the thick walls of the room. She asked me what I thought I was doing last night. She asked me why I had to ruin everything by rolling off that bed. I stared back at her, my breathing shallow and completely controlled. I tried to move my tongue to form a basic word to ask her why she was doing this, but my slurred attempt only made her smile. It was a cold, condescending smile that made my stomach turn. She told me I was deeply confused. She spoke slowly, deliberately articulating every single word as if she were talking to a small child with a severe learning disability. She told me that the doctors had explained everything to her in great detail. She said the massive dose of sedatives combined with the stroke had caused catastrophic damage to my cognitive reasoning. She told me the medical staff warned her that I might suffer from intense, fragmented delusions and drug-induced paranoia. She was actively rewriting my reality right to my face. She claimed that I had been acting strangely for months, that the stress of my corporate auditing job had finally broken my mind. She insisted that I had taken those pills myself, because I could no longer handle the pressure of my daily life. I listened as she systematically dismantled the truth. She told me I imagined the conversation in the hallway. She asked me why I would ever dream up such a horrible, twisted fantasy about my own brother-in-law. She laughed softly, a dry, humorless sound, and pointed out how ridiculous it was to think that Greg, a highly successful suburban real estate developer, would ever want to harm me. She painted a picture where I was simply an aging, paranoid man losing his grip on sanity. It was a brilliant, terrifying strategy. She was laying the groundwork for a complete psychological takeover. If I ever regained my speech and tried to tell the police that she and Greg attempted to murder me, she would simply produce my medical charts. She would point to the diagnosis of a severe stroke. She would show them the toxicology report detailing an accidental overdose. She would present herself as the long-suffering wife dealing with a brain-damaged, delusional husband. The authorities would look at my slurred speech, my physical weakness, and her immaculate reputation in the church community, and they would dismiss my accusations as the sad ravings of a broken mind. I fought the rising tide of panic by doing exactly what I had done my entire professional life. I anchored my mind to hard, undeniable data. I ignored her whispered lies and focused my internal thoughts on the facts. I visualized the hallway of our home. I recalled the exact make and model of the smoke detector I had purchased from the security firm. I recited the serial number, the battery life specifications, and the specific cloud storage capacity. I remembered the exact encryption password I had set up on my personal smartphone to secure the video feed. I knew the camera was hardwired to record motion and upload the encrypted files instantly. I knew it had captured Greg entering the room. I knew it had captured the audio of their murderous plot. My sanity was completely intact. My memory was flawless. But I also recognized the extreme danger of my current position. I was physically defenseless. I was lying in a hospital bed completely at the mercy of the woman who had just tried to orchestrate my death. If I showed any sign of anger, if I let her see the clarity in my eyes, she might decide to finish the job right here in the intensive care unit. She could easily pinch my oxygen tube or inject an air bubble into my intravenous line and blame it on another sudden medical complication. I had to play the role she assigned me. I let my eyes wander lazily around the room. I let my jaw hang slightly slack. I gave her the exact blank, confused stare of a severely damaged man. Patricia seemed satisfied with my apparent lack of comprehension. She sat back in her chair, crossing her legs and casually browsing through the messages on her phone. She looked completely relaxed, entirely confident that her problem was permanently neutralized. I needed to access the outside world. I needed to secure that video footage before she accidentally discovered the hidden camera or before the cloud server automatically overwrote the data. The only way to retrieve the evidence was through my personal smartphone, which I always kept in my suit jacket pocket. A young nurse pushed open the heavy wooden door, carrying a tray of fresh intravenous fluid bags and a digital blood pressure monitor. She offered a bright, cheerful greeting and began checking the various machines clustered around my bed. This was my only chance to bypass Patricia. I gathered every single ounce of my remaining strength. I forced my vocal cords to vibrate, pushing past the chemical numbness restricting my throat. I managed to form a rough, raspy sentence. I looked directly at the nurse and asked her where my personal belongings were stored. I slurred the words, but the request was clear enough. I told the nurse I needed my smartphone to check an urgent email from my accounting firm. The nurse smiled sympathetically and reached for the small plastic patient belongings bag resting on the bottom shelf of a nearby medical cart. Before the nurse's fingers could even touch the plastic bag, Patricia moved. She glided out of her chair with a smooth, elegant grace, stepping directly between the medical cart and my bed. She placed a gentle, remarkably soothing hand flat against my chest, pressing me softly back into the pillows. Patricia turned her head and flashed a bright, appreciative smile at the young nurse. She played the protective, loving wife with effortless charm. Then she looked down at me, her eyes locking onto mine with a cold, dead intensity that the nurse could not see. She leaned down so her face was hovering right above my ear. Her voice was sweet, musical, and dripping with absolute venom. "You need to rest, honey," she whispered, her fingers digging painfully into my collarbone. "Do not worry about a thing. I have taken care of all your devices." The transition from the sterile hospital to my own home should have been a profound relief. Instead, it felt like being transported from a temporary medical holding cell directly into a maximum security prison. 2 hospital transport workers rolled my wheelchair up the steep concrete incline of my front driveway. The crisp autumn leaves were scattered across the perfectly manicured lawn, looking exactly as they had before my entire life shattered. Patricia walked briskly ahead of us. She unlocked the heavy front door and held it open with a manufactured expression of absolute gratitude. She thanked the transport team profusely, pressing a crisp $20 bill into each of their hands. She told them how incredibly blessed she felt to finally have her beloved husband back under her own roof. They smiled warmly, completely charmed by the devoted suburban wife. I sat silently in the chair, unable to warn them that they were eagerly handing me over to my executioner. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. The metallic echo of the deadbolt sliding into place sounded like a steel gate locking permanently. The loving facade instantly evaporated. Patricia did not even bother to look at me. She walked straight past my wheelchair into the expansive kitchen, tossing her keys onto the granite counter. The house was perfectly quiet, but the silence was suffocating. Every familiar object around me felt entirely foreign. The framed wedding photos, the imported rugs, the antique grandfather clock now belonged to a life I no longer controlled. The space I had paid for with 30 years of grueling corporate auditing was no longer my sanctuary. I tried to shift my weight in the wheelchair, but my muscles trembled violently. The residual cocktail of the heavy sedatives and the minor neurological trauma had left my limbs weak and uncoordinated. I was a helpless passenger trapped inside a failing physical vessel. Patricia returned from the kitchen holding a glass of filtered water and a small paper cup containing 2 white pills. She placed them on the side table next to my chair. She told me the guest bedroom on the ground floor had been prepared for me since I could no longer manage the stairs. Her voice carried the bored tone of an annoyed hotel manager dealing with a difficult guest. I stared at the pills. A terrifying wave of vulnerability washed over my chest. I had absolutely no way of knowing if those were actual blood thinners prescribed by the hospital cardiologist or another lethal dose of crushed sedatives. But I knew I could not refuse them openly. I had to maintain the illusion of complete physical and mental compliance. I gave a slow, vacant nod and reached for the cup. Using my clumsy, uncoordinated fingers, I pretended to toss the pills into my mouth while actually slipping them into the deep fold of my sweater. I swallowed the water loudly to complete the performance. The true depth of my nightmare revealed itself the following morning. I woke up in the ground floor guest room to find a thick manila folder resting on my bedside table. Patricia walked into the room holding a steaming cup of coffee. She looked down at me with an expression of supreme arrogant triumph. She did not bother to put on the weeping wife act. There was no audience here to applaud her theatrical performance. She sipped her coffee and casually instructed me to look inside the folder. My hands shook as I awkwardly flipped open the heavy cardboard cover. The bold legal text jumped off the pages, tearing away the last remaining shreds of my personal autonomy. It was a fully executed, durable, and medical power of attorney. The documents bore the official blue stamp of the county clerk and the signature of a notorious local notary who frequently attended Greg and his real estate networking events. I scanned the dense paragraphs, grasping the terrifying reality of what she had accomplished while I lay unconscious in the intensive care unit. Using the medical reports detailing my stroke and the official hospital diagnosis of severe cognitive decline, Patricia had successfully triggered the emergency incapacity clauses in our estate plan. She had legally declared me mentally unfit to manage my own existence. Patricia watched my eyes dart across the dense legal pages. She explained with a terrifying calmness that she now had exclusive, unyielding control over my healthcare directives. If my heart stopped, she alone possessed the authority to sign a do not resuscitate order. But the trap extended far beyond my physical medical care. She casually mentioned that she had already visited the local bank branch. The joint checking accounts, the emergency savings, the investment portfolios, my individual retirement funds, They were all entirely under her sole administrative control. I could not withdraw a single dollar. I could not write a check to hire a defense attorney. I could not even cancel a basic credit card. The sheer brilliance of the legal maneuver left me absolutely breathless. She had effectively erased my identity in the eyes of the law. I was reduced to the status of a dependent child. If I tried to call a cab and walk into a police station to report an attempted murder, the desk sergeant would pull my background check. They would see a man legally deemed mentally incompetent by a team of respected neurologists. They would assume I was suffering from severe paranoid delusions. They would call my legal guardian to come pick me up, and Patricia would arrive with a warm smile apologizing for her poor, confused husband. I was trapped in a flawless, invisible cage constructed out of my own money and my own medical records. I closed the folder and let it slide off my lap onto the floor. I gave her the blank, defeated look she expected. The psychological torture escalated later that week during our traditional Sunday family dinner. Patricia had insisted on hosting, telling everyone it would be good for my recovery. I was wheeled into the dining room, placed at the corner of the long mahogany table. Susan arrived with Greg carrying a casserole dish and a bouquet of flowers. Susan fussed over me, completely oblivious to the monster standing right next to her. Greg wore a sharply tailored navy suit, looking every bit the prosperous suburban developer. He greeted Patricia with a warm, innocent hug, perfectly concealing the fact that they were actively plotting to end my life just a few nights prior. Greg took his seat directly to my right. He poured himself a generous glass of my most expensive vintage red wine, holding it up to the dining room chandelier to admire the color. Throughout the meal, Patricia and Greg put on a spectacular collaborative performance. They spoke about my medical condition with hushed, sorrowful voices. Greg talked about how fragile life was, how we all needed to cherish every single moment with our loved ones. He looked at me with an expression of deep, manufactured sympathy, while secretly reveling in his absolute victory. The main course was served. A thick cut of roasted steak was placed on the porcelain plate in front of me. I picked up the heavy silver knife and fork. My right hand was still plagued by severe intermittent tremors, a lingering side effect of the neurological insult my brain had suffered. I tried to slice into the meat, but the blade slipped loudly against the plate. I tried again, pressing down with all my meager strength, but my fingers simply could not maintain the grip. The knife clattered onto the polished wood table. The conversation stopped. Susan looked at me with immense heartbreaking pity. Patricia offered a heavy, dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes just slightly. Then Greg stood up from his chair. He walked over to my side of the table, leaning heavily over my shoulder. He reached down and took the knife and fork directly from my shaking hands. He spoke loudly enough for the whole room to hear, telling me to relax and let him handle it. The humiliation was absolute and suffocating. I sat there completely frozen as the man who had actively tried to murder me slowly cut my food into tiny bite-sized pieces. Every single slice of the blade felt like a deliberate, calculated mockery. He was demonstrating his complete physical and psychological dominance over my life in front of my own family. He was showing me that I was helpless, weak, and entirely at his mercy. As Greg leaned down to place the fork back onto the edge of my plate, his face came within an inch of my ear. The smell of his expensive cologne was nauseatingly familiar, triggering an instant, terrifying flashback to the dark bedroom. He lowered his voice so only I could hear the venomous whisper beneath the clatter of the dining room conversation. "We take care of our own, Thomas," he murmured, his breath hot against my skin. "You just sit back, stay quiet, and let us take care of you. If you try to fight us, you will find out just how fragile your heart really is." He patted me firmly on the back, causing a sharp jolt of pain to shoot down my spine. He returned to his seat, raising his wine glass to toast Patricia for her incredible strength during this difficult family crisis. I stared down at the small pieces of meat on my plate. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. I forced my shaking hand to pick up the fork, and I ate the food in complete silence. I swallowed my pride, I swallowed my rage, and I let them believe they had completely broken my spirit. The dinner eventually ended. Susan kissed my forehead and promised to visit again soon. Greg gave me a final, condescending wave before following his wife out the front door. Patricia cleaned the dining room, turning off the lights and leaving me alone in the dark shadows of the ground floor. I sat in my wheelchair listening to her footsteps echo up the stairs toward the master bedroom. The silence of the house settled around me thick and oppressive. The brutal reality of my situation was entirely clear. I could not seek external help. The police would demand hard physical evidence. The attorneys would demand a massive retainer fee I could no longer access. The doctors would demand cognitive evaluations that Patricia would seamlessly control. My word against theirs was a guaranteed losing battle. The entire suburban community viewed Greg as a charitable pillar of society, and Patricia as a saintly, devoted caretaker. I was just the tragic, broken husband suffering from a rapid degenerative mental state. There was only one piece of leverage left in the entire world: the footage. The encrypted video and audio files resting safely on the cloud server captured by the motion-activated smoke detector. That single piece of digital evidence was the only thing standing between my survival and a quiet, medically induced death. I wheeled my chair silently out of the dining room and down the dark hallway. I needed to access my local network to log into the cloud portal. I reached into the bottom drawer of a hall console table and pulled out an old spare tablet I used for reading. The battery was low, but the screen illuminated the dark space. I opened the settings menu to connect to the house network. The familiar network name was completely gone. I scanned the list of available connections. There was a newly established network completely locked down with complex security encryption. Patricia had anticipated my need to reach the outside world. She had severed my digital lifeline, changing every router password and locking down the wireless access. Panic flared in my chest, but I pushed it down, relying on cold auditing logic. If the wireless was blocked, I needed a physical hardline connection. I needed my desktop computer. I slowly rotated the wheels of my chair, navigating the narrow passage toward my home office at the back of the house. The office contained my primary workstation, which was wired directly into the main fiber optic modem. I rolled up to the heavy oak door and reached for the brass handle. My trembling fingers wrapped around the metal and I tried to turn it. The knob did not budge. I pulled harder, thinking it was just stuck, but the resistance was solid and unyielding. I ran my fingers upward along the edge of the doorframe and felt the cold, heavy metal of a brand new industrial deadbolt. Patricia had not just changed the digital passwords. She had physically barricaded my only sanctuary. My office, my computer, my financial records, all of it was locked behind an impenetrable barrier. I sat in the pitch-black hallway staring at the brass keyhole. The reality of my imprisonment was absolute. They had stolen my money, my medical rights, my mobility, and my voice. I was completely isolated, stripped of every single defense I had built over a lifetime. But as I sat there in the shadows, gripping the armrests of the wheelchair, a dangerous clarity settled over my mind. They thought locking the door would stop me. They forgot that auditors make a living breaking through locked doors. I was not dead yet. The illuminated numbers on the digital clock beside my bed shifted silently from 2 to 3 in the morning. The sprawling suburban house was perfectly still. For the past 5 days, I had played the role of the defeated lethargic invalid to absolute perfection. I sat in the wheelchair when told. I ate the bland meals Patricia prepared without complaint. I stared blankly at the television screen, pretending my mind was a foggy, broken landscape. I allowed them to believe the stroke had erased my intellect, leaving behind nothing but a compliant hollow shell. But beneath that carefully constructed facade, my brain was operating with the cold, calculating precision of a senior compliance auditor examining a fraudulent ledger. I listened to the faint rhythmic breathing coming from the master bedroom directly above me. Patricia was a deep sleeper, relying on her expensive sound machine to drown out the silence of the night. I knew her habits intimately. It was time to move. I pushed the heavy cotton blanket off my legs. A sharp wave of pins and needles immediately flooded my right side. The lingering effects of the chemical cocktail and the minor neurological trauma made my limbs feel incredibly heavy and uncoordinated. I gripped the wooden armrests of the wheelchair parked beside the bed. I did not dare sit in it. The rubber wheels had a distinct squeak on the polished oak floors, and any mechanical noise would echo straight up the stairwell. I had to walk. I planted my bare feet firmly on the cold wood. I drew a slow, silent breath, filling my lungs and forcing my damaged muscles to bear my weight. The pain was immediate and blinding. My knees buckled slightly, but I locked my jaw and refused to fall. I leaned my shoulder heavily against the plaster wall, using it as a physical crutch to support my right side. I dragged my right foot forward, inch by agonizing inch, moving through the dark guest room and out into the vast open hallway. The house felt like a hostile alien territory. Shadows stretched across the expensive imported rugs, and the moonlight filtered through the large bay windows, casting long, distorted shapes across the walls. Every single step required massive concentration. I kept my breathing shallow, stopping completely whenever the old floorboards groaned under my shifting weight. My destination was not my locked home office. Patricia had secured that door with a heavy industrial deadbolt. She thought she had completely severed my digital access to the outside world by changing the wireless network passwords and locking my workstation. But Patricia did not understand the architecture of modern residential networking. She only understood the surface-level convenience of wireless internet. Years ago, I had personally hardwired the entire house to ensure uninterrupted high-speed data transfers for my massive corporate audit files. I had installed a secondary physical Ethernet port directly behind the massive entertainment center in the main living room. It was meant for the television receiver, but it fed straight back to the primary modem locked inside the office. I finally reached the living room, my hospital-issued pajamas soaked in cold sweat. I slowly lowered myself onto the plush carpet, resting my back against the heavy wooden media console. My hands were shaking violently from the physical exertion, but I could not afford to stop. I reached into the deep pocket of my pajama pants and pulled out the old spare tablet I had salvaged from the hallway drawer earlier that day. I reached behind the television, pulling the thick Ethernet cable from its port. I grabbed a small digital adapter I had quietly pocketed from the kitchen junk drawer. I connected the cable to the tablet. The screen glowed, casting a pale blue light across my sweaty face. I was instantly on the local area network, bypassing the locked wireless completely. Patricia had changed the front door keys to the network, but she had completely ignored the foundation. I opened the network administration portal. People invariably change their daily passwords, but they almost never alter the factory default credentials on the hardware router itself. I typed in the standard numeric sequence. Access was granted instantly. I reconfigured the security protocols, establishing a secure, invisible tunnel directly to the external internet. My heart pounded against my ribs as I opened the web browser and navigated to the security firm cloud storage portal. I entered my personal encryption key. The loading icon spun for what felt like an eternity. Then the directory populated. The hidden camera disguised as a smoke detector had worked flawlessly. I scrolled down to the date of the incident. There were multiple video files time-stamped for that specific evening. I selected the largest file and pressed play, keeping the volume muted and relying on the automatically generated digital captions provided by the security software. The high-definition footage filled the small screen. I saw my own empty hallway. I watched as the master bedroom door opened. Patricia stepped out first, wearing the elegant silk robe I had purchased for her birthday. Her face was calm, completely devoid of any natural panic or grief. Greg followed a second later, pacing nervously beneath the smoke detector. The camera angle captured them with terrifying clarity. I watched the text scroll across the bottom of the screen as they spoke. I read the words detailing their plan to leave the gas fireplace leaking. I read Patricia confirming that she had crushed my prescription sedatives into my bourbon. I saw the arrogant smirk on Greg's face as he mentioned my $3 million life insurance policy and how it would bail out his failing suburban real estate developments. Then Greg spoke the sentence that had burned itself into my memory. "If he wakes up, we are finished. He is an auditor, Patricia. If he survives this, he will rip my finances apart." I watched myself crash onto the floor off-screen. I saw the absolute terror wash over Greg's face as he sprinted down the hallway right past the camera, fleeing like a frightened animal. I saw Patricia stand alone, composing herself, transforming her features into a mask of pure tragedy before dialing the emergency dispatcher. The video ended. I sat in the blue glow of the tablet screen, processing the undeniable visual confirmation of my reality. Patricia had sat by my hospital bed and tried to convince me that I was a broken, paranoid man. She had used my medical trauma to gaslight me into doubting my own sanity. But the data did not lie. The data never lies. I was completely sane. I had survived a calculated, premeditated assassination attempt orchestrated by my own family. A profound, dangerous calm washed over me. The terror and the physical weakness seemed to evaporate, replaced by the absolute clinical focus of an auditor staring at a massive discrepancy. I had the evidence. I could unplug the tablet right now, drag myself out the front door, and hand this footage directly to the local police. Greg would be arrested before breakfast. Patricia would be handcuffed in her silk robe. But as I prepared to close the browser tab, my trained eyes noticed something else on the network directory. When Patricia had locked down the wireless system, she had also connected her personal laptop to the main network to manage the household bills. In her arrogant assumption that I was completely incapacitated, she had left her local sharing permissions wide open. Her entire hard drive was accessible through the wired connection. An auditor never stops at the first piece of evidence. You always follow the entire paper trail. I accessed her remote folders. I bypassed a series of basic, poorly constructed security barriers and opened a primary directory labeled under a local charity organization she managed. It was a classic diversion tactic. I opened the subfolders. They did not contain charity event planning documents or seating charts. They contained massive financial spreadsheets. They contained banking receipts. They contained offshore wire transfer confirmations. I zoomed in on the documents, my eyes scanning the rows of numbers and dates. The earliest transaction was dated 8 months ago. Long before they decided to crush pills into my bourbon, they had been systematically dismantling my financial life. I found the records for my primary retirement accounts, the accounts I had spent 3 decades building through disciplined saving and conservative market investments. They were completely hollowed out. Patricia had been forging my signature on digital authorization forms for months. She had liquidated vast portions of my stock portfolio, transferring the cash into a series of shell companies. I traced the routing numbers across the screen. Every single shell company ultimately linked back to a massive commercial real estate project Greg was trying to desperately keep afloat on the other side of the county. The sheer magnitude of the theft took my breath away. They had not just tried to kill me for a life insurance policy. The $3 million death benefit was merely the grand finale of their operation. It was the final sweeping payout designed to cover the massive, catastrophic hole they had already dug into my life savings. My death was simply the necessary paperwork to finalize their embezzlement and prevent me from ever noticing the missing funds. I sat in the dark living room staring at the irrefutable proof of my financial ruin. My blood turned completely cold. The rules of the game instantly changed. If I took this tablet to the police right now, the criminal justice system would certainly prosecute them for attempted murder. Greg and Patricia would undoubtedly go to prison, but the financial fallout would be an absolute disaster for me. The moment Greg was arrested, his real estate development firm would immediately collapse. His wealthy investors would panic. The massive commercial banks would instantly file for bankruptcy protection and seize all of his active assets to cover their own leveraged loans. My stolen retirement funds, the millions of dollars I had worked my entire adult life to secure, would be hopelessly trapped inside that corporate bankruptcy. My money would vanish into a black hole of federal litigation, court-appointed trustees, and secured creditor claims. I would spend the next decade fighting high-powered corporate lawyers just to recover pennies on the dollar. Even with Patricia behind bars, I would be left completely destitute, physically damaged, and living out my final years on meager government disability checks while the banks kept my money. That outcome was entirely unacceptable. Justice through the standard legal system was no longer enough. Sending them to a sterile prison cell was too merciful. I did not just want them incarcerated. I wanted my money back. I wanted total, absolute financial and personal annihilation of the people who had looked me in the eye and plotted my execution. I needed to extract my stolen wealth from Greg's failing empire before the banks realized what was happening. I needed to shift the liability entirely onto their shoulders. I needed to construct a financial trap so inescapable that when the walls finally closed in, they would be the ones left with absolutely nothing while I walked away completely whole. I quietly closed the digital folders, erasing my access history from the router logs. I disconnected the secure tunnel and restored the network to the exact state I had found it. I unplugged the Ethernet cable and placed the digital adapter back into my pocket. I pressed my back against the console, pulling myself up from the floor. The physical pain in my legs was still there, but it was entirely eclipsed by the burning clarity of my new objective. I dragged my feet across the carpet, moving slowly back through the silent, shadowy hallway toward the guest bedroom. Patricia thought she had trapped a weak-brained, damaged old man inside a legal and medical cage. She thought she held all the cards because she controlled the medical power of attorney and the local bank accounts. She did not realize that she had simply given a master auditor unrestricted access to the biggest case of his entire career. I reached the guest bed and lowered myself onto the mattress, sliding the tablet deep beneath the heavy mattress coils. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, staring at the dark ceiling. I would let them continue their arrogant performance. I would let them cut my steak and mock me at the Sunday dinner table. I would use their absolute certainty of my defeat as my ultimate weapon. I needed a completely new plan. I needed to reach out to the one person outside this house who understood forensic accounting as well as I did. I closed my eyes as the sun began to softly illuminate the suburban street outside my window. The victim was dead. The auditor was finally awake. The morning sunlight bled through the sheer curtains of the guest bedroom, casting long, pale shadows across the foot of my bed. I listened to the sounds of the house waking up around me. Upstairs, I could hear the shower running. Patricia was washing her hair, completely unaware that the foundation of her perfect crime had just cracked. I lay perfectly still under the heavy cotton blanket, staring at the ceiling. The tablet was safely hidden deep within the box springs beneath my mattress. During the final hours of the night, I had meticulously copied every single financial document from her unprotected network directory onto a tiny encrypted micro-storage drive I kept on my keychain. I had disconnected the hidden network bridge and dragged my broken body back into bed just moments before her alarm clock went off. I was physically exhausted, but my mind had never been sharper. 30 years of forensic accounting had trained me to detach my emotions from the raw data. Anger is a useless currency in my profession. It clouds judgment and forces premature actions. Right now, I needed absolute clinical precision. I had to dissect their financial crime layer by layer. When Patricia finally came downstairs, she pushed open my bedroom door holding a plate of scrambled eggs and a glass of orange juice. She wore a tailored beige suit and a perfectly applied layer of expensive makeup. She looked like a grieving wife putting on a brave face for her morning charity committee meeting. She set the tray on the nightstand and offered me a tight, condescending smile. She told me she had to leave for her boutique and that a home care nurse would drop by later in the afternoon to check my vitals. I gave her the slow, vacant nod she expected. I let my hands tremble slightly as I reached for the glass of juice. She watched me struggle with a look of supreme satisfaction before turning on her heel and walking out the front door. The moment I heard the heavy deadbolt lock engage, the helpless invalid persona vanished. I pushed the breakfast tray aside and reached between the mattress coils to retrieve the tablet. The house was completely silent. It was time to perform a financial autopsy on my own ruined life. I opened the copied spreadsheet files and began tracing the digital paper trail. The theft was not a single impulsive act of greed. It was a highly organized, systematic extraction of my lifelong wealth. I started with my primary retirement portfolio. Over the past 8 months, Massive blocks of blue-chip stocks and municipal bonds had been quietly liquidated. The cash proceeds were not wired directly to Greg. That would have triggered automatic fraud alerts at the brokerage firm. Instead, the money was funneled into a newly formed domestic limited liability company registered under Patricia's maiden name. From there, the funds were broken down into smaller, staggered increments and routed through a regional credit union. They were trying to stay just under the federal reporting thresholds for suspicious activity. I traced the routing numbers further down the rabbit hole. The money eventually landed in a commercial holding account managed by Greg's primary real estate enterprise. I stared at the digital transfer receipts, feeling a cold, calculating fury settling deep into my bones. They had treated my life savings like a personal slush fund. I needed to understand exactly why Greg was stealing my money. I opened the operational ledgers Patricia had foolishly kept on her local drive. Greg was attempting to build a massive commercial retail complex called the Oakwood Reserve. It was supposed to be his crowning achievement, a luxury shopping center that would elevate his status among the local suburban elite. But the project was hemorrhaging cash. Construction delays, soaring material costs, and severe zoning disputes had completely drained his initial capital. His wealthy primary investors had pulled out, leaving him holding a toxic asset. To prevent the massive commercial banks from foreclosing on the half-finished property, Greg desperately needed liquid capital to serve as collateral for a high-interest mezzanine loan. He needed millions of dollars in untraceable cash just to keep the bank examiners away from his failing enterprise. My retirement accounts had provided the exact lifeline he required. He was using the money I had earned over 3 decades of grueling corporate labor to prop up his own pathetic ego. The most damning piece of evidence was not the destination of the money, but the timeline of the transfers. I opened the digital authorization forms Patricia had submitted to my brokerage firm. The legal documents required my direct signature to approve the massive asset liquidations. I zoomed in on the bottom of the PDF files. There was my signature perfectly replicated in blue ink, but the dates on the documents were from 6 months ago. This was the critical flaw in their entire operation. Patricia had executed my durable power of attorney only 5 days ago while I was lying paralyzed in the hospital intensive care unit. For the prior 8 months, she possessed absolutely no legal authority to move a single dollar out of my individual retirement accounts. She had forged my signature. She had bypassed the 2-factor security authentication by secretly using my smartphone while I slept beside her. She had committed textbook federal wire fraud long before they ever decided to crush sedatives into my evening bourbon. I turned off the tablet screen and pressed the heels of my hands against my tired eyes. The raw emotion finally threatened to break through my carefully maintained discipline. The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. The woman I had loved and trusted for 20 years had been quietly robbing me blind every single night and then smiling at me over morning coffee. When the accounts were nearly empty and my life insurance policy became the final lucrative prize, she and her sister's husband had simply decided to casually execute me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash the breakfast tray against the wall. I wanted to drag myself out to the sidewalk and tell the entire world what these monsters had done. But the cold, rational mind of the senior compliance auditor forcefully clamped down on the rising panic. I realized with terrifying clarity that walking into a police precinct right now would be a catastrophic tactical error. If I exposed the hidden camera footage and the forged transfer documents, the criminal justice system would immediately arrest Greg and Patricia. They would face swift prosecution for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. But sending them to a concrete prison cell would not automatically return my stolen wealth. The moment Greg was placed in handcuffs, his real estate development firm would completely implode. The massive private equity lenders would instantly declare a default on the mezzanine loan. They would immediately seize all the collateral securing the debt, including the millions of dollars stolen from my retirement accounts. My entire life savings would vanish into a chaotic black hole of corporate bankruptcy litigation. I would become just another unsecured creditor standing in line behind an army of ruthless banking lawyers. I would spend the next decade fighting in civil court only to recover mere pennies on the dollar. I could not allow the banks to keep my money. I could not allow Greg and Patricia to destroy my financial legacy even from behind bars. A messy public divorce or a sudden police raid would only leave me completely destitute and physically broken. I needed a completely different strategy. I needed to shift from being a passive victim to becoming an active apex predator. I had to trigger a systemic collapse of Greg's entire financial foundation on my own precise terms. I needed to extract my stolen wealth back out of his corporate shell companies before the institutional lenders realized the project was dead. More importantly, I needed to construct a legal trap so incredibly tight that Patricia would be held personally and financially liable for the entire catastrophic fallout. They had used the legal system to strip me of my power. I was going to use the exact same legal system to absolutely annihilate them. To execute a financial maneuver of this magnitude, I needed an external operative. I needed someone operating outside the surveillance of my own home who possessed the legal authority to move assets and draft irrevocable contracts. I could not use our regular family attorney because he regularly golfed with Greg at the local country club. I needed a shark. I needed Marcus. Marcus and I had survived the grueling gauntlet of business school together 30 years ago. While I had chosen the quiet, predictable path of corporate compliance, auditing, Marcus had gone on to become one of the most ruthless forensic accountants and trust attorneys in the entire state. He specialized in dismantling complex financial fraud and hiding assets for high-net-worth clients during vicious divorce settlements. He was brilliant, aggressive, and entirely loyal to the few people he considered genuine friends. The immediate challenge was finding a way to meet Marcus without raising any suspicion. Patricia monitored my daily routine with the strict scrutiny of a prison warden. I could not simply invite an aggressive trust attorney into our suburban living room. I needed a perfectly legitimate excuse to leave the house on a regular basis. When the home care nurse finally arrived that afternoon to check my blood pressure, I put on a spectacular performance. I exaggerated my muscle spasms and complained bitterly about the severe lingering stiffness in my right shoulder and leg. I practically begged the nurse for a professional rehabilitation referral, claiming I desperately wanted to regain some small fraction of my physical independence. The sympathetic nurse immediately drafted a recommendation for intensive outpatient physical therapy at a specialized clinic located 3 towns over. When Patricia returned from her boutique that evening, she reviewed the physical therapy recommendation with visible annoyance. She had absolutely no desire to spend her afternoons driving a broken man to a medical clinic. She complained about her busy schedule and the demands of her charity committees. That was exactly what I had counted on. I kept my head down and quietly suggested that she could just hire a private medical transport service to handle the driving. I told her I did not want to be a burden on her valuable time. The subtle manipulation worked perfectly. Patricia eagerly agreed to the transport service, thrilled by the opportunity to outsource her fake caregiving duties while still appearing like a supportive wife. She booked a private medical van for 3 afternoons a week, completely unaware that she was financing my escape vehicle. My first physical therapy appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The medical transport van arrived right on time. The driver, a quiet, unassuming young man, helped me navigate the wheelchair down the driveway and secured me inside the spacious vehicle. Patricia stood on the front porch waving a polite goodbye before turning immediately back into the house. As soon as the van turned the corner and left our affluent neighborhood, I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I had secretly charged it the night before using a hidden outlet in the guest bathroom. I dialed a number I knew completely by heart. Marcus answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him my life was in immediate danger, and I needed his forensic expertise to secure a massive stolen asset. I gave him the exact address of the physical therapy clinic and told him to meet me in the parking lot in exactly 40 minutes. The medical van pulled into the crowded parking lot of the rehabilitation center. I asked the driver to park near the back of the lot, claiming I needed a few minutes to rest and gather my strength before facing the strenuous therapy session. The driver nodded, stepped out of the vehicle, and walked over to a nearby coffee stand to wait. 2 minutes later, a sleek black sedan pulled into the empty space directly next to my open van door. Marcus stepped out. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. He had the intense, calculating eyes of a man who spent his life tearing apart fraudulent empires. He climbed into the back of the medical van, sitting on the bench seat opposite my wheelchair. He looked at my pale face, my trembling hands, and the hospital-issued clothing. I did not wait for him to ask questions. I reached into my pocket and handed him the encrypted micro-storage drive. I looked him dead in the eye and laid out the entire horrific reality of my situation. I explained the crushed sedatives, the open gas valve, the hidden camera footage, and the massive ongoing embezzlement of my retirement funds. I watched the initial shock on Marcus's face rapidly harden into a cold, professional fury. I told him about the forged wire transfers, the shell companies, and Greg's failing commercial real estate collateral. I explained that if we went to the authorities right now, the banks would swallow my money, and I would be left completely destitute. I told him I needed to construct a legal mechanism to quietly rip my assets away from Greg's toxic debt and lock Patricia out of my estate forever. Marcus sat silently in the back of the van, turning the tiny plastic storage drive over in his fingers. He understood the complex financial mechanics instantly. He knew exactly how the private equity lenders would react if they caught wind of a criminal investigation. He looked up at me, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He told me that Patricia and Greg had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed that physical weakness equated to mental defeat. They had left a massive paper trail of federal crimes, and they had foolishly given an auditor the time and the motivation to trace every single digital footprint. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He promised me that we were not just going to recover the money. We were going to build an invisible legal guillotine. The plan required absolute secrecy and perfect timing. I would continue attending the physical therapy sessions, maintaining the pathetic illusion of a broken, helpless man. Marcus would use the encrypted files to draft a new ironclad legal framework. We needed to establish a blind, irrevocable trust completely immune to Patricia's recently acquired power of attorney. We had to execute a silent legal revocation of her authority, filing it directly with the county clerk through a specialized courier so no notifications would ever reach our home address. Marcus would use his forensic team to prepare the necessary documentation to claw back the liquid assets from Greg's shell companies, using the forged signatures as a legal wedge against the receiving banks. We were going to hollow out Greg's financial foundation while he was still completely blind to the threat. The driver returned with his coffee, signaling the end of our brief window. Marcus stood up, placing a firm, reassuring hand on my good shoulder. He told me to stay strong, to keep playing the part, and to never let the rage show in my eyes. He stepped out of the van and disappeared into his black sedan, driving away to begin the quiet legal war. The transport driver helped me out of the van and pushed my wheelchair toward the sliding glass doors of the clinic. I went through the grueling motions of the physical therapy session, enduring the pain and the exhausting exercises with a strange new energy. I grunted and struggled, putting on a show for the therapists, but internally my spirit was soaring. The chemical prison they had built around me was finally beginning to crack. When the medical van finally returned me to the sprawling suburban house later that afternoon, Patricia was waiting in the kitchen. She asked how the therapy went, her voice dripping with that familiar, condescending, fake sympathy. I slumped heavily in my wheelchair, letting my chin drop toward my chest. I told her in a weak, raspy voice that it was exhausting and that I just wanted to go back to bed. She smiled, clearly pleased that her husband remained entirely defeated and dependent on her mercy. She wheeled me into the dark guest bedroom, pulling the heavy cotton blanket up over my legs. She patted my cheek, told me to rest, and closed the door, leaving me alone in the shadows. I lay perfectly still, listening to her footsteps retreat toward the grand living room. She thought she had won. She thought the money was secure, the secret was buried, and the future belonged entirely to her and her arrogant lover. She had no idea that a massive invisible wrecking ball had just been set into motion. She had absolutely no clue that the quiet, boring auditor she had so easily dismissed was currently orchestrating the total systemic annihilation of her entire existence. The trap was officially set. Now I just needed them to confidently step into the kill zone. The scent of roasted garlic and rosemary drifted up the stairs, carrying the illusion of a perfect domestic life. Patricia was in the kitchen cooking one of her elaborate Sunday meals. She absolutely loved playing the role of the devoted suburban host. I sat in my wheelchair, staring out the heavy glass window of the guest bedroom. My scheduled physical therapy appointments had given me the exact cover I needed to operate entirely outside of her surveillance. Marcus was moving with incredible speed on the outside while I maintained my performance as a broken man on the inside. We were actively constructing a financial guillotine right under her nose. The logistics of our covert communication were brilliantly simple. Marcus knew that Patricia monitored my every move, so he completely bypassed my personal devices. He utilized the private medical transport van that Patricia herself had hired. The driver of the van was an unassuming young man who had no idea he was serving as a courier for a massive corporate fraud investigation. During my return trip from the rehabilitation clinic, the driver handed me a thick stack of glossy brochures outlining various physical therapy exercises. Tucked neatly between the brightly colored pages detailing joint mobility and muscle recovery were the heavily redacted legal contracts Marcus had spent the last 48 hours drafting. I had to read them in the brief window of time before the van pulled into my affluent neighborhood. Revoking a durable power of attorney is traditionally a very messy and highly public affair. In normal circumstances, it requires serving formal written notice directly to the acting agent. If I had simply mailed a standard revocation letter to the house, Patricia would have intercepted it immediately. She would have realized her absolute control was compromised, and she would have accelerated her murderous timeline to silence me permanently. But Marcus was not a standard suburban lawyer. He was a vicious corporate trust attorney who understood the hidden back doors of the legal system better than anyone in the state. Marcus explained in his attached notes that there was a specific statutory loophole in our local county jurisdiction. If the principal individual granting the power of attorney could prove they were of sound mind, they could execute a superseding emergency revocation. This emergency document did not require immediate service to the hostile agent if we could prove a profound breach of fiduciary duty. We had the ultimate proof. We had the forged wire transfer authorizations proving Patricia had stolen my retirement funds long before she ever possessed the legal authority to do so. To execute the new documents I needed to definitively prove my cognitive function was completely intact, Marcus arranged a highly unorthodox meeting to satisfy the legal requirements. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, the medical transport van pulled into the empty parking lot behind a large suburban shopping mall. A woman in a conservative gray suit stepped out of a parked sedan and climbed into the back of my transport van. She was an independent mobile notary heavily vetted and hired by Marcus for her absolute discretion. The notary sat across from me, holding her official stamp and a clipboard. She looked at my hospital-issued sweatpants and my trembling hands with a polite but skeptical expression. She was legally obligated to ensure I was completely coherent and acting under my own free will. I stopped my hands from shaking. I sat up perfectly straight in the wheelchair. I looked her directly in the eyes and recited my full name, my social security number, my home address, and the exact current balance of the stolen retirement accounts. I explained the precise legal function of a durable power of attorney and articulated exactly why I was terminating it. The skepticism vanished from her face, instantly replaced by profound professional respect. She realized she was not speaking to a damaged invalid. She was speaking to a senior compliance auditor executing a flawless corporate maneuver. I took the black ink pen from her hand. For the first time in weeks, I did not fake a muscle spasm. I did not pretend to be weak. I gripped the pen firmly and signed my name across the bottom of the revocation documents with aggressive fluid strokes. Every single loop of ink felt like I was physically reclaiming a piece of my stolen identity. The notary stamped the pages, collected her fee, and exited the van without saying another word. Within exactly 2 hours, Marcus walked those freshly signed documents directly into the downtown municipal courthouse. He bypassed the standard filing queues using his extensive professional network to lodge the revocation directly with the chief county clerk. He then deployed a team of aggressive junior associates from his law firm to hand-deliver the emergency injunctions to the compliance officers at every single major financial institution holding our accounts. The trap closed with complete bureaucratic silence. Patricia was legally and permanently stripped of her power to make medical decisions on my behalf. She was entirely locked out of my financial life. But the absolute beauty of the corporate banking system is its sheer lack of urgency. The banks would process the legal revocation internally, updating their massive mainframe databases over the course of several days. The automated systems do not send out urgent push notifications to alert an agent that their authority has been terminated. They simply wait for the agent to attempt a transaction and then they deny access. Patricia would not receive a phone call. She would not receive an email. She would remain completely oblivious until the exact moment she tried to reach her hand back into the cookie jar. But severing her control was only the very first phase of the operation. Now came the absolute most critical component. We had to secure the life insurance policy. The $3 million death benefit was the crown jewel of their entire murderous plot. Greg was depending on that exact massive payout to save his failing commercial real estate venture from total institutional foreclosure. If they killed me, the insurance company would issue a check directly to Patricia as the primary beneficiary. She would then funnel that clean, untraceable cash into Greg's offshore shell companies, effectively laundering the blood money through his corporate developments. I had to rip that ultimate prize away from them without making a single sound. Marcus drafted the extensive legal architecture for a blind, irrevocable trust. A standard revocable trust leaves the creator with complete access to the funds, but it also leaves the assets vulnerable to external legal claims and marital disputes. An irrevocable trust is an entirely different beast. It is an impenetrable legal fortress. Once an asset is formally transferred into this specific type of corporate structure, it ceases to belong to the individual creator. It becomes a completely standalone legal entity governed by a strict appointed trustee. I sat in the back of the transport van on another rainy afternoon and signed the secondary wave of paperwork. I transferred the primary beneficiary status of my $3 million life insurance policy directly into the new trust. I legally changed the ownership title of our remaining uncompromised investment portfolios, moving them out of our joint marital name and burying them deep inside the trust. I even executed a quiet quitclaim deed, transferring the primary equity of our sprawling suburban home into the trust. I appointed Marcus as the sole managing trustee with strict fiduciary instructions that neither Patricia nor Greg could ever access a single penny under any circumstances. By the time I finished signing the last page, I was technically one of the poorest men in my entire affluent neighborhood. I owned absolutely nothing. But the trust owned everything. And because the trust was completely irrevocable, even if Patricia somehow discovered it and dragged me into a vicious divorce court, no judge in the state could force me to dissolve it. The assets were permanently insulated. The true genius of Marcus's strategy, however, was the digital mirage he carefully constructed to keep Patricia complacent. If Patricia realized the money was gone, she would panic. She would immediately contact Greg and they would likely flee the state before I could expose their previous crimes. We had to maintain the illusion of her absolute financial dominance. Marcus utilized his contacts within the banking security departments to execute a rare administrative hold. We left Patricia's online banking logins completely functional. If she sat at the kitchen island, opened her sleek silver laptop, and checked the account balances, she would still see the familiar massive numbers staring back at her. The digital interface would look entirely normal. But those numbers were nothing more than digital ghosts. They were just placeholder pixels rendering on a high-resolution screen. If she actually tried to initiate a real wire transfer, the transaction would instantly hit the invisible administrative wall. It would flag as an unauthorized external attempt, silently failing in the background while displaying a generic processing error on her screen. We had locked her inside a digital simulation of her own stolen wealth. I spent the next 3 entire days sitting quietly in my wheelchair just watching her operate. The sheer scale of her arrogance was absolutely fascinating to observe. She glided through the house with the unearned confidence of a lottery winner who had already cashed the winning ticket. She brought me lukewarm cups of herbal tea. She gently tucked the heavy woolen blanket around my knees. She spoke to me in that soft, musical voice dripping with fake maternal affection. She genuinely thought she was tending to a dying cash cow. Every time she smiled at me, I pictured the encrypted hard drive resting safely inside Marcus's office vault containing high-definition footage of her plotting my murder. I knew, however, that merely securing my remaining assets was not enough to satisfy the immense debt they owed me. Securing the money only protected my future. It did not punish them for what they had done to my past. If I simply confronted them right now with the hidden camera footage, they would deny everything. Greg was a wealthy, well-connected developer. He would hire a team of high-priced, aggressive defense attorneys. Patricia would put on another weeping performance for the courtroom. She would claim she was overwhelmed by caregiver fatigue and that she made terrible financial mistakes out of sheer panic regarding my declining health. They would drag the legal proceedings out for years. They might negotiate a lenient plea deal. They might even walk away with probation. I could not allow them to simply walk away. I did not just want them incarcerated in a sterile, minimum-security federal prison camp. I wanted their entire social, financial, and personal existence burned down to the fundamental foundation. I wanted them stripped of their country club memberships, their leased luxury vehicles, their pristine suburban reputations, and their arrogant pride. To achieve that level of absolute destruction, I needed them to commit an act so incredibly brazen and so undeniably criminal that no lawyer on the face of the earth could ever possibly save them. I needed to force their hand. I needed them to escalate their timeline and trap themselves in a public, inescapable failure. I analyzed the raw data of Greg's failing real estate project. The Oakwood Reserve development was bleeding massive amounts of capital every single day. The institutional lenders were circling his corporate accounts like starving vultures waiting to trigger the foreclosure clauses. Greg was drowning in high-interest debt, and desperate men inevitably make catastrophic tactical errors. They needed the final payout from my life insurance policy to satisfy the bank examiners. But they could only collect that money if I was dead. I realized the only way to destroy them completely was to make them confidently step right into my waiting trap while the whole world was watching. The legal snares were perfectly set. The financial accounts were locked inside a concrete vault. The only thing left to do was offer them the ultimate irresistible bait. I had to make them believe their window of opportunity was rapidly expiring. I had to convince them that I was on the absolute brink of a natural medical death. If they truly believed my heart was going to fail on its own, their entire criminal scheme would fall apart. A natural death in a sterile hospital environment under the strict supervision of trained cardiologists would completely negate their narrative of a tragic carbon monoxide accident. A hospital death would likely trigger mandatory medical reviews, preventing Patricia from quietly cashing out the life insurance policy without raising massive institutional red flags. They desperately needed my death to happen on their exact terms inside the controlled environment of our suburban home. They needed to execute the final lethal stage of their plan before my body gave out on its own. I sat alone in the dark guest bedroom, listening to the heavy rain washing against the exterior siding of the house. The cold, clinical logic of the plan washed over my mind, silencing any remaining emotional hesitation. I was no longer the loving husband grieving a shattered marriage. I was the senior auditor preparing to deliver a fatal financial judgment. I had survived their initial chemical assault. I had bypassed their legal barricades. I had quietly stripped them of their stolen wealth. Now I had to become the perfect fragile victim one last time. I had to stage a dramatic physical collapse that would push their greed past the point of rational thought. I would give them the exact desperate motivation they needed to finalize their crime. The board was completely set. It was time to invite the predators into the kill zone. In the world of corporate compliance, there is a fundamental truth that every seasoned auditor eventually learns. Criminals rarely get caught because they lack intelligence. They get caught because they lack patience. When a fraudster feels the walls closing in, their heart rate elevates, their breathing turns shallow, and their survival instincts completely override their meticulous planning. They stop acting like architects and start acting like cornered animals. For the past 3 weeks, I had been patiently building an invisible cage around my wife and her lover. I had secured my assets and severed her legal authority. But a cage is entirely useless unless the animal actually steps inside and triggers the mechanism. I needed Patricia and Greg to make one final catastrophic mistake. I needed them to commit an act of federal treason against my estate. To force their hand, I had to give them the one thing that terrifies a predator more than anything else. I had to show them that their prey was about to expire before they could finish feeding. I began my physical deterioration on a cold Monday morning. I knew that simply telling Patricia I felt unwell would never be enough. She was a master of observation when it suited her. I had to manufacture a biological crisis so convincing that it would completely bypass her natural suspicion. I stopped drinking water during the day, allowing mild dehydration to hollow out my cheeks and give my skin a pale, ashen pallor. I practiced holding my breath for long intervals until my lips turned a faint shade of blue. I intentionally skipped meals, letting my hospital-issued clothes hang loosely off my frame. The stroke they had engineered had already provided me with a baseline of physical weakness. All I had to do was amplify that weakness into a terrifying display of congestive heart failure. The performance reached its crescendo on a Thursday evening. Patricia was sitting at the kitchen island, casually flipping through a glossy luxury real estate magazine. She was already shopping for her post-morning life. I shuffled slowly out of the guest bedroom, dragging my right leg heavily across the polished hardwood floor. I reached the entrance to the kitchen and deliberately allowed my knee to buckle. I caught myself heavily against the doorframe, knocking a framed photograph off the wall. The glass shattered loudly against the floor. Patricia jumped out of her stool, her eyes wide with sudden alarm. I clutched the center of my chest with a trembling hand, letting my jaw fall slack. I forced my breathing to become rapid, shallow, and ragged. I squeezed my eyes shut and let out a low, agonizing groan, sliding slowly down the doorframe until I was kneeling in the broken glass. Patricia did not rush forward to comfort me. She stood completely frozen behind the granite counter. Her eyes were not filled with the panicked grief of a loving wife. They were filled with the cold, terrified calculus of a criminal watching her timeline disintegrate. If I suffered a massive fatal heart attack right there on the kitchen floor, she would be forced to call an ambulance. A sudden unattended death in a suburban home automatically triggers a coroner investigation. An autopsy would be absolutely mandatory. The medical examiner would draw blood samples and analyze tissue. They would undoubtedly discover the massive, lingering chemical footprint of the heavy sedatives she had crushed into my bourbon weeks earlier. The narrative of an accidental stroke would be torn to shreds under the microscope of a forensic pathologist. She needed me to die slowly and predictably under the unquestioning care of a hospice doctor, not suddenly in a pile of broken glass. I watched her hands tremble as she pulled her smartphone from her designer purse. She did not dial emergency services. She dialed Greg. I remained slumped against the doorframe, focusing entirely on maintaining my labored breathing. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard her hushed, frantic whispers. She told Greg that my heart was giving out. She told him my skin was gray and I was clutching my chest. She demanded that he get over to the house immediately. She was losing control, and control was the only currency Patricia truly valued. Greg arrived less than 10 minutes later, practically tearing the front door off its hinges. He was wearing a damp golf shirt and khakis, completely out of breath. He rushed into the kitchen and stopped dead in his tracks, staring down at me. I was laying on the floor, staring blankly at the ceiling, taking short, agonizing gasps of air. Greg grabbed Patricia by the arm and pulled her roughly into the adjacent laundry room out of my direct line of sight, but they were still well within the auditory range of my completely intact hearing. Their hushed voices bounced off the tiled walls of the laundry room. Greg was absolutely terrified. He whispered that if I died tonight, the probate courts would immediately freeze every single asset attached to my Social Security number. He explained that a death certificate would trigger an automatic lock on all financial accounts, pending a formal legal review of the estate. The $3 million life insurance policy would take months to process and investigate, especially if the coroner raised any red flags. Greg was sweating profusely. He told Patricia that the massive commercial bank holding the note on his Oakwood Reserve project had just issued a final formal notice of default. He needed $300,000 of liquid capital wired into his offshore holding company by Friday afternoon, or they were going to padlock the construction gates and seize his entire firm. He could not wait for the life insurance payout. He needed the cash right now. Patricia spoke with a sharp and desperate edge. She reminded him that they had already drained the primary retirement accounts. The only liquid asset remaining was my primary executive brokerage account. It held exactly $400,000 in highly stable municipal bonds and cash equivalents. It was the financial anchor I had built over 30 years of relentless auditing. Patricia told Greg that she still had the digital login credentials, but initiating a wire transfer of that magnitude directly to an offshore limited liability company would require a secondary layer of authenticated authorization. It required my physical signature on a digitally scanned document. I lay on the floor listening to them convince themselves to cross the ultimate threshold. Fraudsters are notoriously brilliant at rationalizing their own destruction. Greg argued that since I was clearly dying right now, there would be no one left to dispute the signature. He reasoned that the brokerage firm would process the request, assume I had authorized it in a final act of estate planning, and release the funds. Once the money hit the offshore account in the Cayman Islands, it would be instantly scrubbed and routed back into his commercial development firm as a legitimate foreign investment. Patricia agreed. Her greed completely blinded her to the massive systemic risk they were undertaking. They were no longer acting like calculated murderers. They were acting like desperate gamblers, pushing all their stolen chips into the center of the table on a losing hand. Greg stepped back into the kitchen and knelt beside me. He placed 2 fingers against my neck, checking my pulse. I kept my heart rate elevated and my eyes completely unfocused. He looked up at Patricia and nodded. He effortlessly scooped his arms under my shoulders and dragged my dead weight down the hallway, dropping me roughly onto the mattress in the guest bedroom. He did not bother to check if I was comfortable. He simply pulled the door shut, leaving me alone in the dark. The moment the latch clicked, I rolled onto my side and reached under the mattress. I pulled out the tablet and activated the secure tunnel to the hidden camera network. The smoke detector mounted in the hallway outside my door provided a crystal-clear, high-definition feed of their movements. Patricia and Greg were standing at the dining room table. Patricia had her sleek silver laptop open. The bright glow of the screen illuminated their faces in the dark room. Greg was pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair. Patricia was typing furiously. She was logging into my primary brokerage account using the stolen credentials. I watched the live video feed as she navigated through the security prompts. She was completely unaware that Marcus, my ruthless trust attorney, had already legally transferred the ownership of that specific account into the blind, irrevocable trust just 48 hours prior. Marcus had anticipated this exact scenario. He had instructed the compliance officers at the brokerage firm to leave the superficial digital interface completely unchanged. The account still displayed my name. It still showed a balance of $400,000. But the underlying routing architecture had been entirely rewired. Any attempt to move funds out of that account would not just be declined, it would be automatically captured, flagged, and instantly forwarded to the federal authorities as a critical security breach involving a protected legal trust. I watched the screen of my tablet as Patricia pulled a piece of heavy stock printer paper from the home office drawer. She set it on the dining room table next to the laptop. She picked up a blue fountain pen. Greg stopped pacing and leaned over her shoulder. The microphone on the hidden camera picked up their voices perfectly. Greg told her to make sure the loops on the signature matched my historical documents exactly. He reminded her that brokerage compliance officers used optical character recognition software to verify the authenticity of massive wire transfers. Patricia confidently replied that she had practiced my signature 1,000 times over our 20-year marriage. She claimed she could forge my handwriting better than I could write it myself. She pressed the pen to the paper. I watched the physical execution of federal fraud in real time. She signed my name, authorizing the complete liquidation of my final financial asset and directing the funds to an unregulated offshore corporate entity. She placed the forged document into the flatbed scanner resting on the corner of the dining room console. The green light of the scanner swept across the glass, digitizing the crime. She attached the fraudulent file to the wire transfer request on her laptop. The moment hovered in the air, heavy with absolute finality. Up until this very second, their crimes had been largely domestic and localized. Slipping crushed sedatives into a drink is a monstrous act of attempted murder, but it remains under the jurisdiction of local county prosecutors. Forging a few minor retirement withdrawals is a state-level offense. But executing a multi-$100,000 wire transfer across international borders using the digital infrastructure of the American banking system elevates the crime into an entirely different stratosphere. By utilizing an electronic communication grid to execute a scheme to defraud, they were triggering the strict parameters of federal wire fraud. It is a terrifying mechanism of the justice system. The federal government does not care about suburban gossip or local country club reputations. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not investigate crimes, they simply document convictions. When the feds move, they move with the crushing weight of absolute institutional certainty. Patricia hovered her finger over the trackpad of the laptop. She looked up at Greg. He gave her a firm, definitive nod. His eyes were wide with desperate anticipation. Patricia pressed down on the trackpad. The distinct click echoed through the hallway and registered perfectly on my tablet audio feed. She hit send. In that exact microsecond, the digital packets of information left her laptop. They traveled through the hardwired modem I had installed years ago out into the suburban fiber optic grid and directly into the secure servers of the massive brokerage firm. The transaction immediately hit the invisible concrete wall Marcus had constructed. The automated compliance software recognized the direct conflict between the user credentials and the newly established irrevocable trust. It flagged the transaction as a hostile external threat. Simultaneously, the specific offshore routing numbers Greg had provided triggered a secondary alert. The system automatically generated a suspicious activity report. Because Marcus had proactively briefed a contact within the Cyber Crimes Division of the FBI regarding a potential ongoing attack against a protected trust, the digital alarm bell did not just ring at the bank. It rang directly on the desk of a federal agent. I lay in the dark guest bedroom watching the tablet screen. Patricia and Greg were staring intently at the laptop, waiting for the confirmation screen to appear. They expected to see a green checkmark indicating the funds were processing. Instead, the screen refreshed and displayed a generic gray text box stating that the transaction was under routine administrative review and would require 24 to 48 hours to clear. Patricia let out a frustrated sigh, leaning back in her chair. She complained that the bank was always dragging its feet with large transfers. Greg rubbed his temples, looking incredibly stressed but visibly relieved. He told her that a review was completely standard for international wires. He assured her that as long as the request was in the system, the private equity lenders would give him the weekend grace period he desperately needed. They smiled at each other, sharing a brief, intimate moment of perceived victory. They genuinely believed they had just successfully executed the final masterstroke of their grand design. They had absolutely no idea that they had just locked the doors of their own prison cell and handed the keys directly to the federal government. The snare had not just closed around their ankles, it had snapped shut around their necks. The money was safe. The evidence was secured. The federal authorities were now officially watching. The agonizing period of passive observation was permanently over. It was time to stand up, walk out of the shadows, and completely annihilate the world they had built. Saturday evening descended over the sprawling suburban landscape with a cool, crisp autumn breeze. The Oakwood Country Club stood at the pinnacle of the community, a massive stone and glass architectural marvel dedicated entirely to the illusion of inherited grace and manufactured prestige. Tonight, the club was hosting its most extravagant event of the season. Greg had spared absolutely no expense for his groundbreaking charity gala. He had rented the primary grand ballroom, draping the high ceilings in sweeping white silk and filling every single table with imported white orchids. A string quartet played classical arrangements in the foyer while waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with silver trays bearing expensive champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. This gala was his ultimate coronation. He was introducing his massive commercial retail complex to the local elite, actively using the very money he had stolen from my retirement accounts to buy the liquor they were currently drinking. Back at my house, the home care nurse had finished taking my vitals and departed for the weekend. The heavy front door clicked shut, locking me inside the quiet shadows of the ground floor. I sat in the wheelchair for exactly 60 seconds, listening to the complete silence of the empty house. Then I placed my hands on the padded armrests and pushed myself upward. I did not slump forward. I did not drag my right leg. The minor neurological damage from the stroke had healed significantly over the past few weeks, and the remaining weakness had been nothing more than a calculated theatrical performance. I walked smoothly out of the guest room and climbed the main staircase, heading directly for the master suite for the first time since the night they tried to kill me. I opened my expansive mahogany closet, bypassing the loose hospital-issued sweatpants Patricia had laid out for my daily humiliation. I reached into the very back of the wardrobe and pulled out my finest tailored charcoal gray suit. I selected a crisp, heavily starched white dress shirt and a deep crimson silk tie. I dressed myself with the meticulous, precise care of a soldier preparing for a final, definitive campaign. I fastened my expensive silver watch, adjusting the heavy metal links against my wrist. I slipped into my polished leather Oxford shoes, tying the laces with firm, steady hands. I walked over to the full-length mirror and stared at my reflection. The broken, vulnerable invalid was completely gone. Staring back at me was a senior corporate auditor, fully armored and prepared to execute a terminal judgment. I walked out the front door, leaving the wheelchair sitting empty and useless in the center of the dark living room. The drive to the country club took exactly 20 minutes. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my sedan, feeling the solid, responsive machinery beneath my hands. For weeks, I had been pushed, wheeled, and handled like a fragile piece of broken glass. I had been spoken to like a confused child. Tonight, I was the storm coming to shatter their fragile glass house into a million unrecognizable pieces. When I pulled up to the circular valet stand, the young attendant rushed forward expecting a typical wealthy patron. He opened my door and I stepped out, standing tall under the bright portico lights. I handed him the keys along with a generous tip. I straightened my suit jacket, breathing in the scent of pine and expensive cigar smoke, and walked up the wide stone steps of the clubhouse. The heavy mahogany double doors opened into the sprawling grand ballroom. It was a sea of tailored tuxedos and glittering evening gowns. The room hummed with the vibrant, energetic chatter of 200 affluent guests. At the far end of the hall stood a massive elevated stage, flanked by two enormous digital projector screens, displaying the sleek modern logo of Greg's real estate firm. The local mayor was seated near the front. The head of the community zoning and planning board was laughing near the bar. Our entire congregation from the Sunday church service filled the center tables, sipping wine and exchanging pleasantries. And right at the front table, perfectly positioned in the absolute center of the room, sat Patricia. She was wearing a stunning backless emerald green gown, her hair styled immaculately by a professional salon. She was laughing brightly at a joke made by one of Greg's primary commercial investors, playing the supportive, elegant sister-in-law to absolute perfection. She looked radiant and completely unburdened by the fact that she genuinely believed her husband was at home deteriorating in a dark room, taking his final agonizing breaths. On the elevated stage, Greg was tapping the microphone, calling the massive room to attention. He wore a custom midnight blue tuxedo, his smile bright and artificially humble under the harsh stage lights. He was entirely ready to deliver the defining speech of his miserable life. I stepped fully into the ballroom. I did not announce my presence. I did not shout or cause an immediate loud scene. I simply began walking down the center aisle directly toward the stage. My posture was perfectly straight. My stride was confident, measured, and entirely silent on the thick, luxurious carpet. The ripple effect of my arrival began near the entrance doors. A couple from our church turned around, their polite cocktail smiles instantly freezing on their faces as they recognized the man walking past them. They had been told repeatedly by a weeping Patricia that I was bedridden, suffering from severe cognitive decline, and actively dying of catastrophic heart failure. Yet here I was, looking sharper and more vital than I had in over a decade. The whispers started instantly. They swept through the crowded room like a sudden violent draft of freezing air. Heads turned rapidly. Crystal glasses were slowly lowered to the tables. The ambient, cheerful chatter of the wealthy guests began to die out rapidly, replaced by a stunned, incredibly confused silence. The absolute quiet caught Patricia's attention. She turned in her chair, an annoyed frown briefly crossing her face as she looked back to see what had interrupted the prestigious flow of the evening. Her eyes locked directly onto mine. I watched the color completely and totally drain from her face. Her perfectly manicured hand spasmed violently, knocking her expensive champagne flute against her water glass with a sharp, piercing clink. The emerald gown suddenly looked like a cheap, heavy costume she was desperately trying to shed. Her jaw dropped slightly, and absolute, unadulterated terror flooded her pupils, widening them into dark, black pools of panic. She tried to stand up, her chair scraping loudly against the polished dance floor, but her knees seemed to completely give out beneath her. She sank heavily back down, paralyzed by the impossible, terrifying sight of her murdered husband walking smoothly toward the stage. On the platform, Greg was completely oblivious to the approaching devastation. He was looking down at his presentation note cards, speaking into the microphone with a practiced, booming voice. He was thanking his generous investors, thanking his beautiful wife Susan, who sat nearby looking confused by the sudden silence, and thanking his extended family for their unwavering support during a challenging personal time. He actually had the sheer sickening audacity to mention my name. He asked the room to keep Thomas in their prayers, citing my sudden tragic illness as a profound reminder to cherish every single day. The sheer magnitude of his hypocrisy tasted like ash in the air, but I did not react. I simply kept walking forward. I reached the front row of VIP tables. The silence in the ballroom was now absolute and suffocating. Even the serving staff had frozen in place, holding their silver trays in suspended animation. Greg finally looked up from his notes, sensing the heavy, unnatural atmosphere pressing down on the room. He scanned the crowd, scanning the faces of his silent investors, and his confident, arrogant gaze slammed right into me. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white against the dark grain. The sensitive microphone amplified his sudden, sharp intake of breath, broadcasting his panic to the entire hall. He looked like a man who had just seen a demon materialize under the bright stage lights. I walked up the short flight of carpeted stairs leading directly to the platform. I did not rush. I took each individual step with deliberate, rhythmic precision. Greg stumbled backward away from the podium, bumping heavily into a large, expensive floral arrangement. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of frantic, desperate explanation to the crowd, but his voice completely failed him. He was a cornered, terrified animal, realizing the steel trap had already sprung. Patricia finally found her legs. She scrambled frantically up the side stairs of the stage, her high heels catching on the carpet. She reverted instantly to her only remaining defense mechanism, the one that had saved her in the hospital. She tried to play the frantic, desperately caring wife. She rushed toward me, her arms outstretched, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. She cried out my name, asking what on earth I was doing out of bed, claiming that the neurological damage had caused me to wander off. She turned to the crowd, begging them to forgive my terrible, tragic confusion. She reached out to grab my arm, trying to physically pull me away from the podium and hide me from the investors. I did not yell at her. I did not throw a physical punch. I simply turned my head and gave her a look of such immense clinical emptiness that she froze instantly in her tracks. I stepped neatly around her outstretched hands, treating her like a completely irrelevant physical obstacle. The entire crowd watched in breathless, horrified fascination as her loving wife persona shattered completely against my total, utter indifference. I walked directly to the wooden podium. Greg was backed against the white projector screen, trembling uncontrollably, sweat beading heavily on his forehead and ruining his expensive grooming. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone. Attached to the bottom was the small digital adapter I had used in the living room days earlier. I knew the standard audiovisual configuration for this specific country club ballroom from my previous financial audits. I located the primary input cable resting on the shelf inside the podium, unplugged Greg's sophisticated presentation laptop, and seamlessly connected my own device. I tapped the glass screen exactly twice. I did not need to address the crowd with a dramatic speech. The raw, unedited data would speak for itself. The two massive projector screens flanking the stage flickered black for a fraction of a second. Then the high-definition footage from my hallway smoke detector illuminated the dark room. The video was massive, the colors crisp and entirely undeniable. There was my master bedroom door. There was Patricia walking out in her elegant silk robe. There was Greg, pacing nervously back and forth beneath the camera lens. The audiovisual system in the ballroom was state-of-the-art, designed to project crystal-clear stadium sound to the very back of the massive hall. When Greg's recorded voice began to play, it boomed over the large speakers with terrifying, inescapable volume. The entire elite community of our suburban town listened in absolute horrified silence as Patricia explicitly confirmed that she had crushed the lethal sedatives into my bourbon. They heard her cold, calculating tone as she discussed leaving the gas fireplace valve completely open to fill the room with carbon monoxide. Then came Greg's voice, rich and resonant, echoing across the silent ballroom. He talked eagerly about my $3 million life insurance policy. He talked about using my death to fund the very real estate project they were gathered here tonight to celebrate. And then the ultimate damning sentence ripped through the room, striking every single guest like a physical blow. If he wakes up, we are finished. He is an auditor, Patricia. If he survives this, he will rip my finances apart. The impact on the sophisticated audience was instantaneous and entirely catastrophic. A woman in the second row let out a sharp, genuine, piercing scream. A heavy crystal glass shattered on the hardwood floor as a prominent investor dropped his drink in absolute, unmitigated shock. I looked down at Susan, Greg's wife, and Patricia's sister. She was clutching her chest, her face completely drained of all color, staring up at the massive screen in pure, unadulterated horror. She looked back and forth between her trembling husband on the stage and her sister, her mind struggling violently to process the monstrous reality of their ultimate betrayal. People began standing up, pushing their heavy chairs back, desperate to physically distance themselves from the epic center of the crime. I let the video play to its agonizing conclusion, right up to the exact moment my paralyzed body crashed onto the floor off-screen, and Greg sprinted away down the hallway like a terrified coward. Then I tapped the screen on my phone a second time. The video vanished, replaced immediately by the high-resolution scans of the financial documents. I projected the massive, complex spreadsheets Patricia had hidden on her local laptop drive. I displayed the forged wire transfer authorizations side by side with her maiden name shell company registrations. I magnified the specific routing numbers, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that every single dollar funding Greg's Oakwood Reserve project had been illegally siphoned from my stolen retirement accounts. I stepped up to the microphone. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint mechanical hum of the projector bulbs cooling down. I did not speak with rage or overwhelming sorrow. I spoke with the authoritative, unyielding clinical tone of a senior compliance auditor delivering a final, terminal financial report to a corrupt board of directors. I addressed the wealthy investors sitting frozen in the front rows. I informed them clearly and concisely that the groundbreaking they were celebrating tonight was financed entirely by federal wire fraud and premeditated attempted murder. I explained that the land they were standing on was effectively purchased with blood money stolen from a dying man. I advised them, purely as a professional courtesy, to contact their legal counsel immediately because the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already flagged the offshore accounts, and the remaining assets were currently being permanently frozen by a blind, irrevocable trust. Greg let out a pathetic, guttural sobbing sound. His legs completely gave way, and he collapsed heavily onto the carpeted stage, burying his face in his trembling hands. His entire commercial empire, his pristine reputation, his personal freedom, all of it evaporated instantly in front of the very people he had tried so desperately to impress. Patricia stood paralyzed near the edge of the stage stairs. She was staring out at the massive crowd, searching frantically for a single sympathetic face among her church friends and her charity committee members. She found absolutely nothing but intense, burning disgust. The women who had admired her mere hours ago were now looking at her like she was a dangerous, diseased predator. The flawless facade of the elegant suburban wife was entirely burned away, leaving nothing behind but a desperate, trapped criminal. I disconnected my phone from the podium and slipped it carefully back into my suit jacket. I looked down at the two architects of my suffering. They were utterly ruined, not just financially bankrupt, but completely and permanently erased from the high society they worshipped above all else. I had not laid a single physical finger on either of them. I had simply turned on the bright lights and let their own monstrous greed destroy them in plain sight. I walked down the stage stairs, parting the dense crowd of stunned, silent guests, and headed straight for the grand exit doors, leaving them entirely alone to face the absolute devastation they had built for themselves. Minimum security federal prison would be a relief compared to the hell they were experiencing right now. The audit was officially complete. The accounts were permanently closed. I stepped out into the cool, dark night, taking my first truly free breath in over a month. The air had never tasted so remarkably sweet. I walked toward the waiting cab, leaving the ruins of their lives burning brightly in the rearview mirror. The trap had worked flawlessly. The karma was absolute. The justice was entirely systemic. I was finally incredibly, completely alive. All that remained was the silence of the night and the absolute certainty that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always eventually demands to be heard. If you have ever found yourself surrounded by people who smile to your face while plotting your downfall, remember the lesson of the hidden camera. Do not scream. Do not lash out in anger. Anchor your mind to the facts. Gather your undeniable evidence and wait for the perfect moment to turn the lights on. Let their own arrogance build their prison, and let their own greed lock the door. Thank you for listening to my story. If this narrative resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the true power of patience and subscribe to the channel for more accounts of ultimate undeniable systemic justice. Stand your ground, keep your eyes open, and never let them convince you that you are defeated. The game is never over until you decide to stop playing. Choose the truth over the illusion, and watch the empires fall. Take care of yourselves and stay vigilant out there in the dark. The light always wins in the end. The final frame of the video faded into a stark white rectangle on the massive projector screens. The sudden absence of sound in the ballroom was absolute and terrifying. Nobody dared to breathe. Nobody moved a single muscle. The elite members of our affluent suburban community were entirely paralyzed by the sheer undeniable magnitude of the truth they had just witnessed. For a few agonizing seconds, the only sound in the vast opulent space was the quiet mechanical hum of the projector bulbs cooling down. The carefully constructed illusion of wealth and prestige had been completely ripped away, revealing a foundation built entirely on murderous greed. Then the heavy brass handles of the main ballroom doors turned with a loud metallic clack. The heavy oak doors swung open, hitting the wall stops with a heavy thud that made half the room physically jump in shock. My attorney, Marcus, walked confidently through the entrance. He did not wear a tuxedo like the rest of the frightened guests. He wore a sharp, dark navy business suit and carried a thick leather briefcase. Flanking him on either side were two tall men wearing plain, dark windbreakers. They carried themselves with the unmistakable, rigid, authoritative posture of federal law enforcement. They did not look at the floral arrangements or the terrified faces of the country club members. Their eyes were locked directly on the stage. They moved down the wide center aisle with deliberate, focused purpose. The wealthy investors, real estate brokers, and local politicians parted like water, completely refusing to make eye contact with the approaching agents. Greg was still on his knees on the carpeted stage, weeping uncontrollably into his trembling hands. His custom midnight blue tuxedo was completely ruined, soaked in the cold sweat of a man who realized his life was permanently over. One of the federal agents stepped up the short flight of stairs onto the platform. He produced a dark leather folder, flipping it open to reveal a shining gold badge. He announced his name in a loud, booming voice and stated he was with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Crimes Division. The agent looked down at the disgraced developer and commanded him to stand up. Greg tried to push himself upward, but his legs simply refused to support his heavy weight. The two federal agents reached down and grabbed him by the arms, hauling him upward with zero gentleness. The lead agent recited the federal charges in a loud, clear voice that carried perfectly across the dead silent room. He stated that Greg was being placed under formal arrest for felony wire fraud, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy to commit murder across state lines. He informed Greg that he had the right to remain silent, a right Greg clearly should have exercised before plotting a murder in front of a hidden camera. The metallic clicking of the heavy steel handcuffs closing tightly around Greg's wrists echoed through the sensitive microphone still resting on the wooden podium. The sound was incredibly final. It was the sound of a completely destroyed empire. A loud, agonizing wail suddenly tore through the stunned crowd. Susan pushed her way past a table of paralyzed local politicians. Her expensive evening gown was tangled around her ankles, and heavy tears streamed relentlessly down her face. She climbed the stage stairs, completely ignoring the federal agents. Greg looked at his wife, his face entirely covered in sweat and tears, attempting to stutter out a pathetic, desperate apology. He tried to tell her it was a massive misunderstanding. He begged her to call his defense lawyers. Susan did not say a single word. She did not weep on his shoulder or ask for an explanation. She raised her right hand and struck him across the face with a slap so incredibly forceful it physically snapped his head to the side. The sharp, violent, cracking sound resonated through the entire ballroom. She turned her back on him, completely sobbing heavily as two older women from our church congregation rushed forward to guide her away from the platform. The moment Greg was led away, the invisible spell holding the room hostage was completely broken. The investors erupted into absolute chaos. The wealthy men who had been smiling and toasting him just 20 minutes earlier were now shouting frantically. They pulled out their smartphones, dialing their private wealth managers and aggressive corporate legal teams. I could hear them loudly demanding immediate capital withdrawals and immediate contract terminations. They were desperately trying to sever their financial ties to a man who was about to become the center of a massive federal indictment. Greg's entire commercial real estate empire, the glorious Oakwood Reserve Project, was evaporating into thin air right before my eyes. I turned my attention away from the crumbling stage and looked directly at Patricia. She was still standing near the edge of the carpeted stairs, entirely abandoned by the panicking crowd. The women who usually fawned over her charity work had physically backed away from her, treating her like a highly contagious disease. Nobody wanted to be seen standing near an exposed attempted murderer. Patricia quickly realized that her social standing was completely and utterly annihilated. But human self-preservation is an incredibly powerful instinct. She looked at me, her eyes wide and wet with fresh tears. She decided to attempt the weeping devoted wife routine one final desperate time. She rushed toward me, stopping just a few feet away. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, trembling violently. She told me she was so incredibly sorry. She claimed she had absolutely no idea what Greg was actually planning to do to me. She spun a frantic, pathetic lie, stating that Greg had physically forced her to sign those wire transfer documents under extreme duress. She insisted he had threatened to harm her and to destroy our family if she did not comply with his financial demands. She begged me to believe that she only crushed those pills into my drink because Greg told her it was just a mild sleep aid to help me relax after a long, stressful day. She cried openly, pleading with me to remember the 20 beautiful years of our marriage. She reached out, hoping to grab my hand and pull me back into her manipulative, toxic orbit. I did not step back. I looked at her with a completely hollow expression. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, profound love I once held for this woman had been entirely burned away, leaving behind nothing but cold, analytical judgment. I watched her perfectly manicured hands shaking in the air, and I felt only a mild, clinical disgust. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. I broke the paper seal and pulled out the crisp legal dossier Marcus had prepared for me earlier that week. I held the heavy stack of documents out toward her. She stared at the papers, refusing to take them, so I simply dropped them onto the floor right at her expensive high heels. I spoke in a steady, measured tone, ensuring my voice carried clearly over the rising panic of the wealthy ballroom crowd. I told her to save the theatrical tears for the federal prosecutor who would be interviewing her in the morning. I explained that she was no longer dealing with a confused husband or a vulnerable, paralyzed medical patient. I informed her that the durable medical and financial power of attorney she had so arrogantly executed 5 days ago was completely null and void. I told her I had legally revoked her absolute authority and filed the superseding documents directly with the county clerk before she even woke up to cook me breakfast this morning. Patricia stared at the legal papers resting on the floor, her breathing becoming shallow and incredibly rapid. I continued my presentation, dismantling her entire future with precise surgical terminology. I explained that she was no longer the primary beneficiary of my $3 million life insurance policy. I told her that every single clean financial asset, my individual brokerage accounts, our joint emergency savings, and the deed to the beautiful suburban home we shared had all been legally transferred into a blind, irrevocable trust. I informed her that Marcus was the sole appointed trustee managing those assets. I explained slowly so the reality would truly sink in that she had absolutely no legal standing to access, challenge, or dissolve the trust in any court in the country. She was completely, permanently locked out of my wealth. The money she had tried to kill me for was entirely secured behind an impenetrable legal fortress, but the final crushing blow was yet to come. Patricia still clung to one last piece of superficial pride. She owned a high-end luxury clothing boutique in the center of our affluent town. It was her personal sanctuary, a place where she played the wealthy, successful business owner for the local elite. She used the beautiful store to host charity clothing drives and exclusive private shopping events, constantly securing her dominant position in the suburban hierarchy. I looked her directly in the eyes and delivered the final terminal fact. I explained that her desperate, arrogant attempt to drain my remaining brokerage account had triggered a massive federal investigation. By manually forging my signature and initiating an international wire transfer to Greg's offshore limited liability company, she had actively engaged in international money laundering. I told her that the Securities and Exchange Commission, alongside the federal authorities, had already traced the origin of those stolen funds. Because she had foolishly used the boutique corporate bank accounts to initially mask the outgoing transfers, the federal government now classified her beloved store as an active front for federal racketeering. I informed her that at this exact moment, federal agents were physically placing heavy steel padlocks on the glass doors of her luxury boutique. They were actively seizing her expensive inventory, freezing her merchant credit terminals, and confiscating her business accounting ledgers. Everything she valued more than her own soul, her social standing, her business, her pristine reputation, was officially the property of the United States government. She was not going to walk away from this disaster with a quiet, comfortable divorce settlement. She was facing decades in a federal penitentiary completely stripped of every single dollar and every ounce of dignity she possessed. Patricia looked down at the legal documents resting on the patterned carpet. She slowly looked back up at me, her face completely devoid of any recognizable humanity. The elegant, perfectly groomed woman I had married was entirely gone. She was just a hollow, empty shell standing in a wrinkled designer emerald gown. She could not speak. She could not weep. She did not even attempt to deny the allegations anymore. The sheer monumental weight of her total absolute ruin simply crushed the remaining breath out of her lungs. Her eyes darted wildly around the room looking for an escape, looking for someone to help her. But she found absolutely nothing. The federal agents finished reading Greg his rights and began marching him down the center aisle toward the main exit doors. Marcus walked over and stood quietly by my side, holding his leather briefcase tightly in his hand. We watched as the crowd completely parted for the disgraced real estate developer, leaving a wide path of ultimate shame and public judgment. Greg kept his head down, refusing to look at the investors he had actively betrayed. I turned my back on Patricia, leaving her standing utterly alone in the middle of the chaotic, shifting ballroom. She was a ghost completely erased from the society she had sacrificed my life to impress. The heavy hammer of justice had finally fallen, and the impact was absolutely deafening. I walked past the tables of whispering guests, ignoring their shocked stares and their suddenly respectful silence. They knew exactly who held the real power in the room now. I walked out the heavy mahogany double doors and into the cool, crisp night air. The valet brought my sedan around, instantly opening the door with a completely new level of quiet respect. I tipped him generously and climbed into the comfortable leather driver's seat. I started the engine, listening to the smooth, powerful hum of the motor. I looked back at the massive stone country club one final time. The flashing red and blue lights of local police cruisers were already pulling into the long, circular driveway to assist the federal agents with the massive arrest. The audit was officially complete. The corrupted accounts were permanently closed. I drove away from the blazing lights of the gala, leaving the burning ruins of their destroyed lives far behind me in the dark. 6 months have passed since that spectacular night at the country club. The crisp mountain air sweeping through the tall pine trees outside my window carries a completely different weight than the recycled oxygen of that sterile hospital room. I am sitting on the wide wooden porch of a massive log cabin tucked deep into the quiet, elevated wilderness of Colorado. The morning sun warms the rough timber, radiating a profound, deeply settling peace. I hold a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee in my hands. My right hand does not tremble. My grip is absolutely firm. The neurological damage they tried to use against me has entirely healed, replaced by the steady, quiet strength of a man who fought his way out of a very dark grave. The physical recovery was a grueling, meticulous process. In the weeks following the gala, I dedicated myself to rebuilding my body with the exact same relentless focus I used to audit corporate ledgers. I hired top-tier physical therapists. I spent hours every single day retraining my muscles, pushing past the lingering chemical numbness that had once kept me a prisoner in my own bed. Every successful step, every regained pound of muscle felt like a profound victory against the people who wanted me dead. I traded the suffocating, perfectly manicured lawns of the affluent suburbs for the rugged, untamed beauty of the mountains. Out here, there are no country club galas, no fake charity committees, and no superficial neighbors judging your worth by the car you drive. There is only the wind, the trees, and the absolute, undeniable truth of survival. The federal justice system moves with a slow, crushing inevitability once the raw data is properly verified. Greg and Patricia did not even attempt to drag the process out through a lengthy, highly publicized criminal trial. The hidden camera footage combined with the pristine digital paper trail Marcus had painstakingly compiled left their high-priced defense attorneys with absolutely zero room to maneuver. The fallout for Greg was incredibly swift and absolutely biblical. The morning after the gala, federal agents executed a massive coordinated raid on his commercial real estate headquarters. Employees watched in stunned silence as agents carried out dozens of cardboard boxes filled with hard drives and financial ledgers. The news hit the local suburban papers immediately. The massive institutional lenders who had financed the Oakwood Reserve project panicked. They triggered every single emergency foreclosure clause in their contracts. The construction gates were padlocked, heavily chained, and slapped with bright orange legal notices. The investors who had cheered for him completely abandoned him, leaving him drowning in an ocean of toxic corporate debt. During the federal interrogations, Greg completely broke down. The arrogant, flashy suburban developer who had confidently cut my steak and whispered threats into my ear dissolved into a weeping, terrified coward. He desperately tried to offer the Cybercrimes Division full unrestricted access to his offshore shell companies, hoping to secure a lighter sentence. He tried to claim he was under immense financial pressure and that the murder plot was entirely Patricia's brilliant idea. Patricia countered with her own pathetic, desperate strategies. She tried to offer state prosecutors detailed information regarding Greg's other corrupt suburban real estate dealings, hoping to paint herself as a manipulated, frightened victim. She sat in the federal holding cell wrapped in a sterile orange jumpsuit, weeping and begging the agents to understand that she was a good woman who simply made a terrible mistake. But the federal government does not operate on tears or suburban gossip. The federal agents simply played the audio recording of her cold, calculating voice, confirming the crushed sedatives. They showed her the high-resolution scans of her meticulously forged wire transfers. The undeniable data completely destroyed her weeping wife persona. Their mutual betrayal was incredibly satisfying to observe from a safe distance. In the end, the federal judge showed them absolutely no mercy. They both accepted harsh, mandatory plea deals to avoid spending the rest of their natural lives behind bars in a maximum security facility. Greg was sentenced to a bleak federal penitentiary stripped of his tailored Navy suits and his arrogant posture. Susan filed for a swift finalized divorce, legally changing her last name and leaving the state to start completely over, far away from the toxic fallout of her husband's crimes. Patricia suffered a unique kind of absolute devastation. The federal authorities formally dissolved her luxury boutique. Federal marshals seized the expensive inventory, auctioning off the designer gowns, and imported jewelry to satisfy the massive federal fines levied against her. The suburban elite she had worshipped, the women from our church who used to attend her exclusive shopping events, entirely erased her from their collective memory. She is currently serving her extensive sentence in a minimum security correctional facility, forced to wear a generic uniform and answer to indifferent wardens. The woman who once complained about the temperature of her imported wine is now a mere numerical barcode in the federal prison database. Her pristine reputation was reduced to absolute ash. She has absolutely nothing left. The millions of dollars they successfully embezzled from my retirement accounts were subjected to a rigorous, aggressive recovery operation. The The federal authorities, working in absolute lockstep with Marcus, tracked every single stolen penny through the complex labyrinth of international wire transfers. Because we had proactively established the blind, irrevocable trust, the restitution process was incredibly smooth and legally insulated. The government simply unfroze the capital, liquidated the seized offshore accounts, and routed the funds directly back into the secure protective architecture Marcus had built. I will never forget the morning Marcus called me to confirm the final transfer. I was sitting on this very porch watching the sunrise over the distant snow-capped peaks. He told me the accounts were fully funded. Every single dollar they had stolen had been forcefully extracted from their ruined empire and returned to my name. My entire life savings were completely restored. With the additional restitution penalties mandated by the federal court, I am currently far wealthier than I was before the terrible night they crushed those sedatives into my bourbon. The numbers on the ledger finally balanced perfectly. Sitting here breathing in the cold, clean air, I find myself contemplating the true fundamental nature of betrayal. For 20 years, I believed I shared my home with a loyal partner. I believed our marriage was a solid, verified asset. I trusted the foundation of my life completely. But human beings are not corporate spreadsheets. You cannot simply audit a human heart to find the hidden darkness lurking inside. Patricia and Greg measured their power strictly in bank accounts, country club memberships, and the superficial illusion of social prestige. They believed that manipulating the legal system and taking a human life would guarantee their ultimate financial security. They viewed my quiet, predictable nature as a fatal weakness. They looked at a senior compliance auditor and saw a boring, aging man who would simply fade away without making a single sound. They thought they could erase me and simply step over my grave to claim their prize. They completely underestimated the raw, terrifying power of absolute silence. They did not understand the weaponized patience required to sit in a wheelchair and swallow a profound daily humiliation. They failed to realize that the undeniable weight of the truth is always heavier than the most elaborate, complex lie. I did not have to lift a single finger to physically harm either of them. I did not need to shout or scream or throw a violent temper tantrum to achieve my vengeance. I simply laid out the factual data and allowed their own monumental greed to do all the heavy lifting. The beautiful poetic justice of my survival is that their insatiable appetite for wealth became the exact mechanism of their ultimate execution. They built a massive, elaborate cage hoping to lock me inside it forever, but they accidentally locked the door from the inside and handed me the only key. Their arrogance blinded them to the reality that every single action leaves a footprint, and every single lie eventually crumbles under the harsh light of undeniable evidence. I did not need to destroy them. Their own monstrous choices orchestrated their absolute ruin. I take a slow, deep sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I do not carry any lingering bitterness or toxic anger. Those emotions are completely useless to me now. They are inefficient and exhausting. I have reclaimed my health, my stolen fortune, and my absolute personal autonomy. The terrifying dark days in that suburban house feel like a distant, fading nightmare completely detached from my current reality. I spend my days hiking the steep mountain trails, breathing the clean air, and enjoying the absolute certainty that my life belongs entirely to me. I survived the darkest betrayal a man can face, and I emerged on the other side completely unbroken. They chose the illusion of wealth, I chose the undeniable power of the truth. If you have ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, do not let them convince you that you are powerless. Sometimes the best move you can make is to stay perfectly still, keep the cameras rolling, and let them build their own prisons. If my story resonated with you, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about surviving the unthinkable.